The story of Ruth is one of those that deeply touches the soul, full of twists and turns that make us reflect on our own journeys. Imagine yourself in her shoes, a young widow, a foreigner in an unfamiliar land, with nothing but her faith and loyalty to guide her. Ruth's life teaches us that even in the darkest moments, God is preparing something extraordinary. And the most impressive part? This story is not just about survival, but about how the faithfulness and courage of a simple woman changed the course of history, culminating in the lineage of Jesus. Who could have imagined that by saying, "Where you go, I will go," Ruth would be opening doors to such a grand future? By walking alongside Naomi and trusting in divine provision, she teaches us powerful lessons about loyalty, faith, and how the unexpected can turn into the greatest of miracles. Want to know how a simple harvest in the fields of Bethlehem transformed Israel's destiny? Let's dive into this story together and discover what Ruth has to teach us about life, faith, and the power of small choices. Ruth, a young Moabite, lived one of the most moving stories of loyalty in the Bible. After losing her husband, she could have gone her own way as Orpah did, but she chose to stay by her mother-in-law Naomi's side. This choice was not merely a matter of family responsibility but a living testament to the deep bond between the two. It's as if Ruth was saying loud and clear, "Your life is now my life." How often do we face moments where we must choose between what's easy and what's right? Ruth's loyalty teaches us that even when the path seems hard, God honors those who are faithful. And have you stopped to think about whom in your life you could be more loyal to? Ruth's commitment goes beyond words. It's a loyalty that crosses boundaries. Leaving Moab and going to Bethlehem with Naomi was a leap of faith. She left her homeland, her roots, and everything she knew, without knowing what the future held. Many times in our own lives we are called to leave our comfort zone, and Ruth's journey teaches us that when we are guided by faith and loyalty, blessings lie ahead, even if we can't see them right away. The question remains, are we willing to do the same, to trust in the uncertain path knowing that God has already prepared our destiny? When they arrived in Bethlehem, the situation for Ruth and Naomi was far from ideal. Poverty, uncertainties, and an unclear future. Yet, Ruth shows us that loyalty does not depend on circumstances. Even in times of hardship, she remains steadfast by Naomi's side. It is inspiring to see how, despite so much adversity, she maintained her posture and determination. This leads us to reflect. Are we being loyal and persistent in our journeys even when the road seems tough? Ruth's life reminds us that loyalty opens doors we never imagined, and it's the starting point for something much greater. Speaking of open doors, it's interesting to note how opportunities began to arise for her, paving the way for divine provision. But that's a topic for the next point. Now in Bethlehem, Ruth needed to find a way to support herself and Naomi. Courageously, she went to work in the fields, gleaning leftover grain that the harvesters left behind. It's intriguing how, even amid difficulties, God was already at work providing everything Ruth and Naomi needed. Often, we don't notice the small provisions of God in our lives. Those opportunities that seem simple can be the gateway to something great. And it was in Boaz's fields that this provision began to manifest, like a shower of blessings in what seemed like barren land. Have you ever thought that what seems little is, in fact, the beginning of a grand provision? Boaz, the owner of the land, immediately noticed Ruth. But what caught his attention was not just her appearance or her humility in working in the fields, but her reputation for loyalty and kindness towards Naomi. In his infinite wisdom, God always places the right people in our path at the right time. Boaz was moved by Ruth's story, and God's grace began to flow in surprising ways. Like Ruth, sometimes we are just working in the field, fulfilling our daily duties without realizing that God is already moving pieces in our favor. Who knows, the next Boaz in your life may already be watching your dedication and faith. God's provision for Ruth was not limited to material sustenance. Boaz, a just and generous man, ensured that Ruth had protection and abundance while she worked in his fields. This shows us how God's hand is present in every detail. He not only meets our needs but also protects us and guides us to places of blessing. And here's a reflection. Where in your life might you be gleaning grains that are actually part of a bigger plan of divine provision? Like Ruth, we might be walking down paths that seem ordinary, but that will soon reveal themselves to be extraordinary. Speaking of extraordinary, Ruth's story is about to take a turn, as God's provision goes beyond what the eyes can see. Want to know how? Let's move on to the next point. Ruth's life took a turn when Boaz, moved by her story, assumed the role of redeemer. In the culture of the time, this meant that Boaz had the responsibility to protect and redeem Ruth and Naomi, ensuring them security and a future. But Boaz's action is much deeper than a simple cultural act. It is a demonstration of divine grace and provision. God, who had guided Ruth to those fields, was now preparing redemption for her and her mother-in-law. It makes us think, how often are we on the brink of a difficult situation and God sends someone to redeem us? Boaz is the figure of one who redeems and transforms, showing that even when everything seems lost, God has a plan of redemption. Boaz not only redeemed Ruth from her status as a widow and foreigner but also elevated her to a position of honor in Israel. His role as a redeemer reflected the very heart of God, who always seeks to redeem those who are lost, giving them a new identity and purpose. Boaz offered Ruth more than financial security. He offered her dignity, hope, and a new life. How often do we find ourselves in situations where we need this kind of rescue, whether emotional, spiritual, or even financial? Just as Boaz was Ruth's redeemer, God often sends someone or acts directly in our lives to lift us out of difficult circumstances and lead us to a new path. Ruth's story shows us that divine redemption doesn't just happen in grand miracles but in daily acts of kindness and generosity. Boaz did his part, but it was God who orchestrated every detail of this redemption story. It's impossible not to be moved by how the divine plan unfolds in Ruth's life. And so, Boaz's redemption not only restored her life but also paved the way for something even greater, a union that would change Israel's destiny. But let's take it slow because this union between Ruth and Boaz has much to teach us. Get ready for the next point, which will show the impact of their union. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and like the video. The union between Ruth and Boaz was not just a love story, it was an encounter that transformed the destiny of an entire nation. Imagine the scene, a foreigner without many possessions, marrying a man of prestige and honor in Israel. In human eyes, this might seem unlikely, but when God is in control, the improbable becomes inevitable. This marriage symbolizes the union between God's favor and human faithfulness. Ruth was loyal to Naomi, loyal to God, and now she was reaping the rewards of that faithfulness. This story makes us reflect on the connections we make in our own lives. Are we paying attention to the opportunities God places before us that can change our future? The union of Ruth and Boaz was also a testimony to the transforming power of God's grace. Boaz saw in Ruth more than her background or her status as a widow. He saw her heart, her integrity, and her loyalty, qualities that made her special in God's eyes. This reminds us that God doesn't look at the exterior but at our character. When we allow Him to guide our relationships, the connections we make have the power to impact not just our lives but the lives of future generations. The story of Ruth and Boaz is a clear example of how God can use even the most unexpected encounters to fulfill His greater purposes. And this greater purpose becomes even more evident when we look at the impact of their union on Israel's history. From Ruth and Boaz's marriage came a lineage that would forever change the course of God's people. Ruth, a Moabite, would become part of the lineage that would lead to King David and later to Jesus himself. Who could have imagined that the young woman gleaning in the fields of Bethlehem would be part of such a grand plan? It's a powerful reminder that even in our everyday actions, God is working on something much greater than we can see. And so, we reach the conclusion of this incredible story, which takes us directly to the importance of this lineage. Want to know more? Let's move to the final point. Ruth's story could not end more surprisingly. She, a Moabite, a foreigner, entered history as one of the most important ancestors in Israel's lineage. Through her union with Boaz, Ruth became the great-grandmother of King David, Israel's greatest king. This not only elevated her status among the people but placed her in a central role in the redemption plan that would culminate in the birth of Jesus, the Messiah. Ruth's journey from a poor widow in Moab to the mother of a royal lineage is a testimony to the transformative power of God's grace. Once again, we are reminded that God uses those who are faithful, regardless of their background or status. Ruth teaches us that even in the hardest situations, God is working on something much greater than we can imagine. She had no idea that her marriage to Boaz would place her in the lineage of the Savior of the world. But her story shows us that when we are faithful, God can use us in ways that transcend our understanding. Looking at our own lives, how many times are we tempted to give up when things get tough? Ruth's story encourages us to keep going, to trust that God is preparing something extraordinary, even if we can't see it yet. Now think for a moment. Ruth, a Moabite, became an essential part of the lineage that led to the birth of Jesus. This proves that it doesn't matter where we come from, but where God is taking us. Ruth's journey invites us to reflect on how we are living our own stories. Are we being faithful in the small things, trusting that God has a bigger plan for us? This royal lineage shows us that the future God has prepared is always greater than our dreams. And with that, we conclude this part of Ruth's journey, But what comes next is equally fascinating. Now that you know her lineage, what does it mean for your own destiny? Ruth's story is more than a narrative of love and redemption. It is living proof of how faithfulness to God and the people around us can lead to a destiny we never imagined. Ruth, a foreigner, became part of the lineage of King David and, later, of Jesus himself. This shows us that regardless of our origins or the difficulties we face, God has a greater plan for each of us. Now think, how are you living your own story? Are you being loyal to the principles you believe in, even when the circumstances seem unfavorable? Are you paying attention to the opportunities God places in your path, just as Ruth did? Looking at the life of this incredible woman, we are challenged to act with faith, courage, and loyalty in our own lives. If even a simple harvest in the fields brought about eternal changes, imagine what God can do with your daily actions. So, what will you do with this knowledge? Are you ready to allow God to write a new chapter in your story? If you want to continue learning from these transformative stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you'll stay updated on each new teaching that can impact your life and your relationship with God. Let's continue this journey of faith together. And for more content like this, click on the video that appears on the screen.